Picture this. It's February 12th, 1945. The time is exactly 4:47 p.m. Deep in the wooded hills near Epernay, France, a 22-year-old American infantryman named Jack Bighgam is pressed flat against the freezing ground. He was a sniper with the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, part of the U.S. Army's 4th Infantry Division. The late winter air hangs heavy, thick with the smell of gunpowder and damp pine. Clutched in his hands is a Springfield M1903A4 rifle, the standard-issue sniper weapon. But this one has a secret, something highly unusual. The scope mounted on top? It's not military grade. It's something he cobbled together himself. His fellow soldiers? They laughed when they first saw it. A scope fashioned from a broken medical microscope? Held in place by a steel ring from a scavenged German artillery fuse? The dials marked by hand with simple pencil notches? It looked absurd, utterly amateurish. They called it a toy. They called Jack delusional. Some even warned he'd get himself killed trying to play engineer on a live battlefield. But now, just 27 seconds later, those same men are watching in stunned silence as a German Panzer IV tank over 1,200 yards away, that's about 1,100 meters, suddenly erupts into a ball of fire. The boom echoes through the valley. That wasn't artillery. It wasn't an airstrike. It was one man, one bullet, and one homemade scope. Suddenly, no one was laughing anymore. This is the incredible true story of Jack "Red" Bighgam, the American soldier everyone mocked for inventing his own sniper scope, right up until he used it to change the course of a battle. It's a story about doubt, ingenuity, and the one impossible shot that made history. Let's call it Blueprints in the Dirt. Back in the winter of 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, raged through the Ardennes, the men of the 4th Infantry Division were freezing, bone-tired, but slowly pushing eastward. By early February of 1945, the front had shifted into the Champagne-Ardenne region of northeastern France. There, amidst the rolling hills and dense forests near Epernay, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known as 2-3, had a daunting mission: to probe and weaken the German defenses entrenched just beyond the Bois de la Vigne ridge. And among them was a quiet young infantryman named Jack Bighgam. He was from Marshall, Kansas, a farming town of fewer than 10,000 people. Before the war, Jack had never held a rifle in combat. He was a mechanic by trade and a tinkerer by temperament. He was only 19 years old, learning the trade under his uncle at a watch repair shop. Think about that for a second. He could take apart and rebuild a stopwatch blindfolded. His hands were that steady, adjusting those tiny micro-gears with a precision that made older customers joke, "That kid must have nerves of ice." So, when the draft notice came in the spring of '43, it was those very same skills that made him stand out at Fort Benning. During marksmanship training, he wasn't just hitting the target. He was impressing his instructors with how he did it. He was adjusting for windage and elevation intuitively, without even being told. He'd measured distances in his head, using trees, fence lines, even the length of a shadow. But here's the catch. The Army didn't really have a formal sniper program back then. Scopes were rare. So, despite his natural talent, Jack was just another regular rifleman. Fast forward to January 1945. The brutal Battle of the Bulge is over, and the Army is facing a harsh reality. They are dangerously short on trained sharpshooters. Their existing scopes, like the Weaver Model 330C, were broken, fogged up, or just plain lost in the chaos of battle.
Getting replacements was a nightmare. In one battalion of 23 men, there were only 3 scoped rifles for the entire unit. For Jack, this crisis wasn't a problem. It was an opportunity. So, in early February, stationed near Epernay, Jack made a quiet request to visit the battalion's field hospital.
There, he found exactly what he was looking for: a broken microscope, an American-made Bosch & Lomb model, its casing cracked during transport. He carefully salvaged the lens tube, seeing the potential for a new optical sight. For the mounting brackets, he scavenged a steel ring from a destroyed German 88mm shell casing. For 2 straight nights, he worked tirelessly, soldering, filing, and balancing this bizarre contraption onto the barrel of his standard-issue Springfield M1903A4. And what was the reaction when he showed it to his squad? They absolutely burst out laughing. "That thing looks like it belongs in a science fair," one of them jeered. Another one chimed in, "Hey Bighgam, you going to diagnose a germ or shoot a kraut with that?" Even his platoon sergeant just dismissed it with a shrug. "It ain't regulation," he said. "Don't come crying to me when it shatters on your first shot." But Jack didn't even flinch. He believed in his creation because he had built it with his own 2 hands. He'd already tested its range in the woods west of their camp, tracking tree lines, measuring its consistency over and over. Now, let's be clear, the scope was far from perfect. The image had a weird bluish tint. The lens scratched if you looked at it wrong, and the zero would drift with the slightest temperature change. But it worked. It magnified. It aligned, and most importantly, it was the only scope he had. He wasn't trying to be some kind of hero. He was just trying to be useful. And you have to understand, in the rigid hierarchy of the 1945 American Army, innovation was supposed to come from the top down, not from a 19-year-old rifleman with a broken microscope. Jack Bighgam was about to prove the exact opposite. He was about to show that sometimes the most critical advances in war aren't born in sterile laboratories or bustling factories. No, they're born in the mud, under enemy fire, and forged in the hands of a quiet young man who simply refused to accept standard issue. This was about 1,200 yards of pure doubt. Jack Bighgam never even thought about asking for permission to build his scope. He knew better. In the Army, improvisation was a dirty word, unless it came straight from the top brass. But what he did ask for, quietly and respectfully, was time. Time at night. Time alone. Time to create something far better than what he'd been given, which was absolutely nothing. In those freezing February nights of 1945, Jack worked under a simple canvas tent just past the tree line west of Epernay. He carefully wrapped his gear in burlap and oilcloth, anything to muffle the telltale clank of metal tools. His only light was a flashlight, its beam softened by red cellophane he'd liberated from a medic's signaling kit. He kept meticulous notes in a tiny ledger, calculating everything: distances, crosswind drift, even adjustments for the biting temperature changes. He was methodical, obsessive, laser-focused. He carefully dismantled the microscope tube into its 3 core components: the objective lens, the focus ring, and the ocular. Then he mounted this makeshift system onto his Springfield rifle's receiver, using 2 rings he'd fashioned by hand, clamped down with scavenged bolts. The vertical reticle, the all-important crosshair, was hand-painted onto a single strand of wire pulled from a field telephone cable, stretched tight across a ring of dental cement. It wasn't pretty, but it was dead-on precise. Every single evening after dusk, Jack would walk out to a clearing they called Red Hill, not for blood, but for its iron-rich soil. And there he practiced. He'd set up old rusted helmets on fence posts at different distances. First 200 yards, then 400, then 600. Each night he'd pace a little farther ack. He took notes, measured the bullet's angle of fall, and tracked how his homemade lens held up in the brutal cold. The scope did fog up a bit in the freezing air, but he found a fix for that too, applying a whisper-thin film of soap to the interior glass and polishing it off. It worked. It worked well enough. Jack never said much to the other guys during these nightly drills. They knew where he was going. Some watched from a distance, probably amused. Most just ignored him. His platoon sergeant, however, warned him once and sternly, "You are wasting ammunition we don't have." Jack's reply was short and confident. "Sir, I'll bring them back clean." By February 10th, the division's intelligence reports lit up. They'd confirmed increased German armor movement near the WWII.
Specifically, models identified as Panzerkampfwagen IV. These machines, the Panzer IVs, were the iron backbone of Germany's armored divisions for most of the war. The variant most frequently encountered in this sector was the formidable H model, armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun and shielded by frontal armor a solid 80mm thick. If you were an infantryman caught in the open, staring down one of these panzers, well, that was a death sentence. The usual solutions were what you'd expect: calling in air support, pounding it with anti-tank artillery, or getting dangerously close with a bazooka. A rifle? Even a sniper rifle? That was like throwing a rock at a fortress. But Jack wasn't aiming for the fortress walls. He was a student of his enemy. He'd pored over the diagrams of the Panzer IV. He knew its anatomy, its secrets. He knew that the engine deck at the rear of the tank held the fuel intake caps, which were often left exposed when crews refueled in a rush. He'd also seen, more than once, spare fuel canisters strapped carelessly to the back of German armor. It was standard procedure, making them easy to reach, but also making them dangerously vulnerable. His plan was to aim for that. Not the thick hull, not the rotating turret, but a soft, unprotected target. His goal wasn't a catastrophic explosion, it was chaos. A fire, a forced stop, a panicked crew bailing out. That would be enough to break the German momentum. His plan wasn't born from madness, it was born from cold calculation.
But nobody believed in it. Not yet. By February 11, 1945, with the enemy on the move, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment pushed to the edge of the Buis de Lane, a dense forest overlooking a shallow valley near the Mon River. The 4th Infantry Division's orders were clear: smash through the German lines, wipe out the last pockets of resistance, and seize the high ground for the big spring offensive into Germany itself. But there was a problem. Something felt wrong. Scouts were reporting a spike in armor traffic along a winding dirt road, a muddy track hidden by the tree line, making it almost invisible from the air, the perfect route for moving tanks discreetly. Intelligence soon confirmed their fears. At least 3 Panzer IV tanks were dug in along the forest's western edge, rotating their guard shifts every 6 hours. The Germans were digging in, preparing to make a stand. That very morning, during a tense command briefing, Lieutenant Colonel Harris made a highly unusual request to his platoon leaders. He needed a sharpshooter in position by the following daybreak. Someone quiet, steady, who knew the terrain like the back of his hand. The mission was as simple as it was deadly. Observe, and, if the opportunity arose, disrupt German vehicle movements without engaging their infantry. Sow confusion, pick off an officer, force a delay. Only one name came to mind: Bighgam. "I hear you've been playing scientist with a rifle." Harris's voice cut through the tension in the command tent. He looked Jack over, not like a soldier, but like a piece of gear he wasn't sure he could rely on. "You think that thing of yours can actually hit anything past 400 yards?" Jack's response was firm. "I know it can, sir." Harris didn't react. No nod, no smile. He just slid a map across the table, his finger circling a spot. Grid 17 Alpha. The mission? An elevated thicket of pine trees, a nest overlooking suspected German tank positions nearly 1,200 yards away. It was a clear line of sight, sure, but this was a long shot. Longer than regulation. Longer than any doctrine would ever recommend. The orders were chillingly simple. You'll go in before dawn. No backup, no noise, and Jack, no second chances. Yes, sir. That night, Jack's kit was stripped to the bone. Just his Springfield rifle, that homemade scope mounted on top. 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, each one hand-selected for perfect consistency. A pair of wire cutters, 2 canteens of water, and a single chocolate bar. Noticeably absent, a sidearm. He wasn't planning on fighting his way out. As dusk bled from the sky, he moved out, a lone figure cutting through a frost-covered field toward Grid 17 Alpha. He made the ridge just after midnight, carving out a shallow hide for himself under a fallen pine. The moon, a pale disk behind thin clouds, cast long silvery shadows that danced on the treetops. The silence was profound, almost unnatural. No insects, not even a whisper of wind. The only sounds were the distant, heavy thud of artillery and the sporadic bark of a German machine gun far off to the east. In his hide, Jack began his ritual. He adjusted the scope, making tiny, precise movements. He carved small notches into a branch above him, a crude but effective way to track any shift in the wind. He mentally measured distances, using fence posts and the width of the valley floor as his ruler. He checked the tension on the mounting rings again. Everything had to be perfect, tight, aligned. Then he went still. For nearly 6 hours, he lay prone, motionless, becoming part of the landscape. Then, just as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, a column of smoke. The Panzer. It was on the move, slow and deliberate. It rumbled out from the tree line and came to a stop just beyond the ridge. Steam hissed from its exhausts. A crew member, bareheaded, likely the loader, climbed out and started refueling from a jerry can strapped to the rear hull. This was it. The moment Jack had been waiting for. One mistake. One exposed canister. One single chance. He let out a slow, controlled breath. 1,200 yards. The target was no bigger than a lunchbox. He'd have less than 3 seconds of visibility. He steadied the crosshairs, letting them rest on the can. His finger found the trigger. And in that instant, the world fell silent. This was the trigger pull that would change everything. A shot across 1,200 yards. That's 1,100 meters, nearly 3/4 of a mile, spanning a muddy French valley shrouded in the cold morning fog. There was no spotter, no backup, no guarantee he'd make the shot. It was just one man, one rifle, and a makeshift scope he'd rigged himself. Jack Bighgam took a slow, steady breath. His body was a statue, but his mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Through the lens, he could see the tank perfectly. Framed in the crisp, cold morning light sat a German Panzer IV Ausführung H, caked in mud and frost. Its hefty 75mm cannon was angled slightly down, idling in place. Just behind it, 2 crew members were busy refueling from a jerry can strapped to the rear hull. They were moving fast, confident in their safety. After all, the American front line was more than a kilometer away. Who would be crazy enough to even try a shot from that distance? Jack's eyes narrowed into slits. He wasn't aiming for the turret or the hull. That would be pointless. A suicide mission for the bullet. The Panzer's armor, a solid 80 millimeters thick at the front, would just laugh off a rifle round. Even from his powerful .30 caliber Springfield, the bullet would just pancake against it like a combing. But Jack wasn't trying to punch through steel. He was aiming for something much softer, much more flammable. He'd done his homework. He knew German refueling procedures were often rushed, especially when they felt the pressure. If that crew left the cap just a little loose, or spilled even a few drops of fuel near the intake, it was all he needed to start a fire. And if that fire managed to reach the ammunition stowed right next to the engine bay, well, then a single rifle round could set off something far, far worse. He brought the reticle into perfect alignment. A hand-painted wire stretched across his view like a delicate cross of light. The wind had died down. Now it was just a gentle breeze from the west, maybe 3 miles per hour. He carefully adjusted for the drift. A quarter inch off at the muzzle would mean being several feet wide of the mark at this range. He took one deep breath in, held it, and squeezed. The recoil gave a gentle kick against his shoulder. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the valley, and for a split second, nothing. And then everything happened. A tiny spark, a sharp hiss, then a sudden bloom of orange flame. The jerry can went up first, showering the crew in burning fuel. One of them let out a horrific scream. The other tried desperately to run. Flames began to lick up the back of the tank, catching on the engine grate before crawling inside. And then, with a sound like thunder trapped inside a steel drum, the ammunition inside the Panzer cooked off. The tank detonated from the inside out, a massive fireball punching straight up into the pine-etched sky. Bighgam didn't even flinch. His finger simply slid from the trigger. He just watched as thick, black smoke billowed into the morning light. Chaos erupting among the nearby German troops as they scrambled to figure out what in the world had just happened. Some were pointing frantically, others were diving for cover. But nobody could pinpoint where that impossible shot had come from. It was just too far, too precise. Back on the American side, the soldiers of the 23rd watched in stunned silence. They'd heard the single shot. Then they saw the flash of fire, and then the explosion. At first, not a single person said anything. Then a corporal muttered, "No way! That wasn't Bighgam, was it?" Another replied, "He's the only one out there." By the time Jack crawled back into the tree line hours later, his hands were raw and numb from the cold. His face was speckled with dirt. He looked completely exhausted. And when he returned to the forward operating post, nobody laughed, nobody scoffed. They just looked at the rifle, then at the scope, then at him. There were no medals, no ceremony, just a heavy, quiet awe. Jack Bighgam had just made the impossible shot, with a rifle no one trusted and a scope no one believed in. He didn't say a single word. He didn't have to. The mocking had stopped.
When Jack Bighgam returned to base that afternoon, the war around him hadn't changed, but something else had. It was the way people looked at him, the tone in their voices, the silence that now replaced the usual sarcasm. The man they once called Scope Boy or Optics Jack now walked among them with a quiet gravity. Not because he had asked for respect, but because he had earned it. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, Lieutenant Colonel Harris received a message from battalion headquarters. German radio intercepts had picked up chatter about a suspected American sniper attack on an armored unit. The Panzer that had gone up in flames, serial number unknown, had been part of a mobile counterattack force meant to halt the 4th Infantry's eastward push. It never even got the chance. Jack's single shot had crippled that movement, and in doing so, it created a ripple effect. The German tank crews immediately began changing their procedures. Fuel canisters were now stored farther from the rear deck. Refueling was delayed until vehicles were safely under cover. Hatches were kept closed unless absolutely necessary. That kind of adjustment doesn't come from a rumor. It comes from fear. The command staff at the 23rd called Jack in for a debrief the next morning. The officers wanted to know everything: his process, his calculations, his scope. He brought it in. The handmade optic was now blackened slightly from residue and frost. He explained how he had used a broken Bausch & Lomb microscope, how he had calibrated it using match marks and pure trial and error, and how he had painted his reticle from a single wire strand taken from a communications cable. They took notes, real notes. For the first time, people were truly listening. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned in, his voice cutting through the tension. "Could you teach this?" Jack's reply was immediate, without a hint of hesitation. "Yes, sir." The very next week, Jack found himself temporarily reassigned to division-level training. It wasn't permanent, just a short stint to pass on his unique methods to a select group of riflemen, handpicked from across the entire 4th Infantry. His lessons were deceptively simple, yet incredibly powerful. Improvise, but with absolute precision. Measure everything, twice. Trust your gut, but always, always back it up with hard data. Even one of the sergeants who'd once openly mocked Jack came around. He asked if he could just look through the scope. Jack obliged. The sergeant held it up, squinting into the light, a frown creasing his brow. He handed it back, shaking his head. "This thing's ugly as sin," he muttered, "but damn, it works." Back at camp, the whispers turned into a buzz. Word spread far beyond their own unit. Another battalion sent a runner, officially requesting a demonstration of his technique. Then, a major from division staff appeared out of nowhere, unannounced, asking for a written summary of his methods. Nobody could quite wrap their head around it. This homemade scope, cobbled together in the woods from scrap parts and solder, had accomplished something no standard-issue sniper rifle had ever managed in this sector. It had stopped a tank. Not by destroying it with raw power, but by outthinking it. But Jack, he didn't gloat. That just wasn't his way. He kept to himself, same as always. His evenings were spent in quiet ritual, rechecking the scope, meticulously cleaning the bolt, running his fingers along the cold steel barrel like a master mechanic tending to a prized engine. He understood something fundamental. He wasn't chasing glory or medals. He was chasing perfect reliability. The rifle, the scope, the shot, they had all merged into a single story. His story. And even though he never once asked for recognition, the Army was now watching him very closely. Because in a massive war of machines and mass production, Jack Bighgam had proven an ancient truth. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you're issued, but the one you build with your own two hands. The war would end, but his legacy was just beginning. The fighting raged on for another 3 months, until, in May of 1945, Nazi Germany finally surrendered. Across Europe, the guns fell silent. The cities were skeletal ruins. The fields of Champagne, Normandy, and the Ardennes were graveyards of rusting steel, where memories soaked deep into the mud. For most soldiers, Jack Bighgam included, there was no grand ceremony, no dramatic farewell. There were just orders, orders to pack up, orders to return home, and orders to try and forget everything they had seen. So Jack returned to Kansas in the summer of that year. The town of Marshall welcomed him back quietly. And when he got home, he found his parents had kept his workshop exactly as he had left it, a silent testament waiting for his return. Everything was just as he left it. The same tools, the same broken watches, and a notebook still open on the table with a pencil marking that read 3 seconds drift at 500 yards. Jack never really talked about what happened over there. When the neighbors would ask, he'd just offer a polite smile and say, "I did my part." And for them, that was enough. But the rifle, that came home with him. The Springfield M19034, and right alongside it, that homemade scope. Still scratched, still patched with wire and glue. For years, it just sat in a locked cabinet, completely untouched. Then, in the 1950s, Jack got an invitation to speak at a local veterans gathering. He decided to bring the scope and rifle along. Not to brag, not at all. He wanted to show what a person could achieve with the right motivation and the right mindset. The audience was completely silent as he told his story. It wasn't just about the shot. It was about the ridicule he faced, the failures he endured, and the perseverance that saw him through. He finished with a line so powerful it would later be etched onto a brass plaque right next to his display in the Regional War Museum. He said, "It was never about the scope. It was about believing that I could make something better, even when no one else believed it with me." Now, the Army never formally adopted Jack's design, but his story? It found its way into the unofficial lore of infantry sharpshooting. During the Korean War, and even into Vietnam, you'd hear instructors telling new recruits about the Kansas boy who built his own scope and took out a tank. Of course, the details got exaggerated. That's how war stories go. But the core truth was always there. One soldier's willingness to think outside the box had made a real, measurable difference. Fast forward to the late 1970s. A military historian, deep in research on improvised WWII weapons, managed to track Jack down. They talked for hours. Jack even showed him the scope, now carefully stored in a padded, flannel-lined case. The historian took meticulous notes, which later became a chapter in a little-known book called Tools of Last Resort: Ingenuity in Combat. That very same year, Jack donated both the scope and the rifle to the Kansas Military History Center. And that's where it sits today, inside a glass case, right beneath a faded photograph of a young man with a square jaw, steady eyes, and grease-stained fingers. Most visitors just walk right on by, not even noticing. But some people stop. They lean in closer, read the caption, and their eyes trace the deep scratches in the steel. And in that moment, they get it. This was never a story about a war hero covered in medals and celebrated with fanfare. This was the story of a quiet mechanic who simply refused to accept the word impossible. Jack Bighgam never went searching for a legacy, but he absolutely left one behind. A legacy of how one bullet could change doctrine. You see, Jack Bighgam never for a second considered himself a strategist. This wasn't some general wearing stars on his shoulders, sitting in a war room drawing arrows on maps. This was a corporal, a man in the field, a trigger puller who just happened to think about tools in a totally different way. But you see, sometimes history isn't shoved forward by the planners, it's nudged along by the practitioners. In the months following the Panzer incident, Jack's story started to filter quietly through the channels of the 4th Infantry Division, eventually making its way into after-action reports and field evaluations. And while it was never written down as official doctrine, the implications were impossible to ignore. First, the Army came to a huge realization. It had completely underestimated the potential for innovation right there on the battlefield. Jack had taken broken parts, a damaged microscope, steel from artillery fragments, and scrap wire, and he turned it all into something functional while under fire. That alone was a masterclass in resourcefulness. Second, he had pinpointed a massive tactical blind spot. Most sniper training back then focused on infantry targets, officers, machine gun nests, forward observers. Very few people ever entertained the idea that a sniper could influence armored warfare. Jack had proven that under the right conditions, a single, well-placed rifle shot could disrupt or even destroy a vehicle, so long as the target wasn't the armor, but the vulnerability hiding behind it. In response, several after-action reviews began recommending expanded sniper training, specifically including how to identify soft spots on enemy equipment. A small clause was even added to a post-war field manual in the late 1940s. Personnel should be trained to identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized units when conditions permit. It didn't mention Jack by name, but that sentence was born from his single shot. And third, Jack's success reignited the entire conversation about sniper doctrine itself. During World War II, the U.S. military had fallen behind both the Soviets and the Germans in sniper development. The Soviets fielded over 20,000 trained snipers by the war's end. The Germans were feared for their precision and superior optics. The American approach, by contrast, was decentralized, inconsistent, and heavily dependent on whatever equipment was available. Jack's homemade scope, as crude as it was, forced officers to ask a deeper question. What if we empowered soldiers to innovate at the front, rather than wait for top-down solutions? In the 1950s, the Army began investing more seriously in optic standardization and sniper training programs. By the time Vietnam arrived, snipers were no longer an afterthought. They were a strategic asset. The rifles got better. The optics became clearer. Military doctrine itself grew sharper. Now, Jack Bighgam didn't single-handedly cause all of that. But what he did do was prove something absolutely vital. He showed that battlefield intelligence isn't just about collecting data. It's about seeing the battlefield for what it is and knowing when it's screaming for you to adapt. Fast forward to today, and you'll find soldiers in training programs studying the very same things. Weak points on enemy vehicles. They're being taught to think on their feet under immense pressure, to find solutions that aren't in the manual, and even how to build their own gear when the supply lines break down. And where did those lessons come from? Not from a textbook. They came from a man in a forest in France who simply refused to accept that standard issue meant it was the only option. It was one shot, one scope, one quiet act of defiance against doctrine, and from it a ripple effect that would echo through generations of marksmen, engineers, and soldiers. They all came to understand a crucial truth. Precision isn't always in the tool. Sometimes it's in the will of the person using it. Think about it. In every war, we see names carved into stone monuments. Generals, battles, victories, dates. But history is also forged in the quieter moments. Without fanfare, without headlines. It's shaped by a single decision, a hand-built solution, one act of defiance that nobody ever saw coming. Jack Bighgam never sought the spotlight. He didn't write a book or call himself a hero. He wasn't chasing medals, and he wasn't trying to overhaul the entire army. And yet, his story, the story of one man, one rifle, and one makeshift scope, forces us to rethink what we know about courage, skill, and innovation under fire. His defining moment didn't arrive in some blaze of glory. It came in the stillness, in absolute control, fueled by the quiet belief that he could see what others were missing and hit a target everyone else thought was impossible. The reality is, most of us are conditioned to follow the manual, to stay in our lane, to wait for permission. But if you look at any major breakthrough, in science, in war, in human progress, it always comes from someone who looked at the status quo and decided, this isn't good enough, I can do better. You see, Jack's homemade scope wasn't just some clever piece of engineering, it was a statement. A statement that ideas matter, even the ones that seem ridiculous at first. It proved that perseverance is often ridiculed right up until the very second it works. It showed that sometimes the only thing separating failure from a breakthrough is the simple willingness to try. Just picture the battlefield he was on, a world of mud, fear, and steel. A world where fitting in, where conformity, is what keeps you alive. And in the middle of all that, this one man, armed with nothing but a cracked microscope lens and a steel ring from enemy shrapnel, managed to change the course of a battle. He did it not by following orders, but by thinking past them. We're in an age now where technology is everywhere, where precision is built in, where our tools are factory perfect, digital, exact. And yet, that very spirit that fueled Jack Bighgam is more crucial today than ever. Why? Because we're still up against challenges that can't be cracked with off-the-shelf solutions. Problems that demand someone with the courage to say, fine, I'll build it myself, I'll figure it out. Could that be you? Have you ever been told your big idea just won't fly? That it looks strange, that you're wasting your time, that nobody does it that way? Well, maybe, just maybe, that's the single best reason to double down and keep pushing forward. Jack's legacy teaches us that real innovation isn't a department on an org chart, it's a mindset. And sometimes the smallest tweak in the hands of a truly determined person can create ripples no one ever saw coming. One man, one lens, one single bullet, and a moment that echoes across 80 years. So, what about you? What part of Jack Bingham's story hit you the hardest? Was it the ridicule he endured, that deafening silence after the shot, or the legacy he built that nobody predicted? Or maybe it's the question woven through his life. What could you create if you just stopped waiting for someone to give you permission? Let us know in the comments. Your perspective matters. Your story could be the next one that inspires. And if this story moved you, please share it. Because somewhere out there, someone else is staring at their own homemade scope, wondering if it's enough. Your belief in them could be the one shot they've been waiting for. Thank you for watching.